April 15, 1945. British soldiers of the 11th Armored Division approached what they believed was just another prisoner of war camp. What they discovered behind those gates would haunt them for the rest of their lives. This wasn't a military installation. This was hell on earth. And what these brave men witnessed would become one of the most shocking revelations of the entire Second World War. Today we're going to tell you the untold story of the liberation of Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, a story of unimaginable horror, extraordinary courage, and the moment when the true face of evil was finally exposed to the world. If you think you know everything about World War II, think again. What happened at Bergen-Belsen was beyond anything these hardened soldiers had ever encountered on any battlefield. Before we dive into this incredible but disturbing story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. We bring you the most compelling and least known stories from British military history every single week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next. Lieutenant Colonel Mervyn Gonen was there. He was one of the first British officers to enter Bergen-Belsen, and decades later he would still struggle to find words adequate to describe what he saw. "I had been hardened by 6 years of war," he would later write, "but I was not hardened to this." The 11th Armored Division, known as the Black Bull Division, had been fighting their way through Germany for weeks. These were not green recruits. These were battle-tested veterans who had seen some of the war's fiercest combat. They had fought through Normandy, crossed the Rhine, and liberated countless towns and villages. They thought they had seen everything war could throw at them. They were wrong. As the tanks and vehicles approached the camp on that spring morning, something was immediately wrong. There was a smell, an overwhelming, nauseating stench that hit the soldiers before they even saw the camp. It was the smell of death, of disease, of human suffering on an industrial scale. Some men vomited. Others wrapped cloths around their faces, but nothing could prepare them for what lay ahead. The camp had been handed over to the British by the Germans under a truce agreement. Wehrmacht officers had approached British lines days earlier with an unusual proposal. Bergen-Belsen was in danger of a typhus epidemic spreading beyond its walls. They wanted to avoid the camp becoming a combat zone. What they didn't tell the British was the true state of the camp's inhabitants. When the gates finally opened, the scene was apocalyptic. Thousands of emaciated prisoners, more skeleton than human, stumbled toward the British soldiers. Many could barely walk, some crawled. Others simply stared with hollow eyes that had seen too much. These weren't just prisoners of war. These were victims of systematic starvation, disease, and deliberate brutality that defied comprehension. Brigadier Glenn Hughes, the senior medical officer who arrived shortly after the initial liberation, assessed the situation with military precision. There were approximately 60,000 prisoners in the camp. 10,000 were already dead, lying where they had fallen. Another 30,000 were so severely ill that they would die within days without immediate intervention. The remaining 20,000 had some chance of survival, but only if help came fast. The British Army had liberated towns and cities across Europe, but this was different. This required not just military might, but humanitarian action on a scale never before attempted. Within hours, Hughes was organizing the greatest rescue operation in British military history. Medical supplies, food, water, and personnel began flooding toward Bergen-Belsen.
But they faced an impossible dilemma. The prisoners were starving, but you couldn't just give them regular rations. Their bodies were so damaged that normal food would kill them. Too much, too fast, and their systems would shut down. The medical teams had to carefully calibrate every calorie, every vitamin, every drop of water. It was a race against time, and time was running out fast. Lieutenant John Randall, a young officer with the Royal Army Medical Corps, found himself making life-and-death decisions every minute. You'd look at someone and know they had hours, maybe minutes left, he remembered. But there were so many. You had to decide who you could save and who was beyond help. No one should ever have to make those choices. the soldiers worked around the clock. They carried the living to makeshift hospitals. They buried the dead in mass graves, giving them what dignity they could. They distributed food, water, and medicine. They held hands with the dying. They listened to stories that would give them nightmares for the rest of their lives. And they documented everything, knowing that the world had to see what had happened here. Word began to spread through the British forces. This wasn't just another camp. This was something unprecedented. More soldiers volunteered to help. Medical students from nearby liberated universities came to assist. The BBC sent reporters and cameramen. What they recorded would shock the world and provide undeniable evidence of crimes that some would later try to deny ever happened. Among the prisoners were people from across Europe. Poles, Russians, French, Dutch, Hungarians, and many others. But the majority were Jews who had been systematically targeted for extermination. Many had survived other camps, only to be sent to Bergen-Belsen as the Nazis retreated. Anne Frank had died here just weeks before liberation. Her sister Margot, too. So close to freedom, yet they never lived to see it. The British soldiers heard stories that seemed impossible. Tales of selections where people were chosen for death on a whim. Of medical experiments that turned doctors into monsters, of families torn apart, children murdered, and suffering that served no military purpose whatsoever. This wasn't collateral damage from war, this was deliberate, systematic genocide. If this story is affecting you as much as it affected those brave British soldiers, show your support by hitting the like button and leaving a comment below. Let us know you're watching and share your thoughts on this crucial moment in history. The conditions inside the camp defied belief. There was no running water, no sanitation. Typhus, typhoid, tuberculosis, and dysentery ran rampant. The prisoners had been reduced to fighting over scraps of food. Some had resorted to cannibalism just to survive one more day. The guards, who remained in the camp under British custody, showed no remorse. Many seemed confused about why the British were so upset. One British soldier later wrote home, "I never understood what evil truly meant until I walked through those gates." These people hadn't just been imprisoned, they had been deliberately destroyed, body and soul. And the worst part? The people who did this thought it was normal, necessary even. As night fell on that first day, the British troops who had entered Bergen-Belsen were forever changed. They had seen combat, they had seen friends die, but nothing in their military training had prepared them for this. This wasn't war as they understood it. This was something far darker. And they knew that their duty now was not just to liberate, but to save as many lives as possible and to bear witness to what humanity was capable of at its worst. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen had begun, but the real battle was just starting. A battle not against enemy soldiers, but against disease, starvation, and death itself. The British Army was about to undertake one of the greatest humanitarian operations in military history. But could they save these people? Could they bring them back from the brink of death? And what would they do with the guards and staff who had perpetrated these crimes? In Part 2, we'll take you deeper into the massive rescue operation that followed. You'll learn about the innovative medical techniques British doctors pioneered to save the unsavable. You'll hear the stories of individual prisoners and the soldiers who refused to give up on them. And you'll discover how this one camp changed the way the world understood the true nature of the Nazi regime. This is a story that must be told. These heroes, both the liberators and the liberated, must never be forgotten. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on because Part 2 drops soon and you won't want to miss it.
In Part 1, we witnessed the moment British soldiers of the 11th Armored Division opened the gates of Bergen-Belsen and discovered a horror beyond imagination. 60,000 prisoners, 10,000 dead bodies lying in the open, and a humanitarian crisis that demanded immediate action. The British didn't hesitate. They rolled up their sleeves and got to work. But what came next was perhaps even more challenging than any battle they had fought during the entire war.
Welcome back to our series on the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Today, we're diving deep into the massive rescue operation that followed, the innovative medical solutions British doctors developed under impossible conditions, and the personal stories of courage that emerged from the darkest chapter of the Second World War. If you missed part 1, go back and watch it now. This is a story that needs to be told in full. And if you're already with us, make sure you're subscribed, because part 3 is coming, and the conclusion of this story will leave you thinking about these events for a long time to come. Brigadier Glyn Hughes stood in the center of what had become the largest emergency hospital in British military history. Around him, thousands of people clung to life by the thinnest of threads. His problem was unprecedented. How do you save people who have been systematically starved and tortured for months or years? How do you reverse the kind of physical damage that the human body was never meant to survive? The standard military medical approach wouldn't work. These weren't wounded soldiers who needed surgery and antibiotics. These were people whose bodies had consumed themselves to survive. Their organs were failing, their immune systems were destroyed, their minds were traumatized beyond measure, and there were tens of thousands of them. Hughes made a decision that would save countless lives. He called for every medical resource the British Army could spare. Within days, 96 medical students from London teaching hospitals volunteered to come to Bergen-Belsen. They left their studies, their comfortable lives, and traveled to Germany to help. Many of them were younger than some of the prisoners they would try to save. Lieutenant Colonel James Johnston, one of the senior British medical officers, developed what became known as the Bergen-Belsen diet. It sounds simple now, but at the time it was revolutionary. He created a special liquid formula that provided nutrition without overwhelming the prisoners' damaged digestive systems. It was carefully calibrated with proteins, fats, and vitamins in exact proportions. Too much, and the patient would die. Too little, and they wouldn't recover. The medical teams worked in shifts around the clock. They set up feeding stations where prisoners were given small amounts of this special formula every few hours. It was painstaking work. Each person had to be monitored individually. Some improved rapidly. Others declined despite everything the British doctors tried. The mortality rate in those first weeks was heartbreaking. People who had survived years of Nazi persecution died just days after liberation, their bodies too damaged to recover. But there were miracles too. Private Sid Lewis of the Royal Army Medical Corps remembered one young woman who came in weighing less than 70 pounds. She couldn't speak, could barely move, he recalled. We didn't think she'd make it through the night, but she did, and the next night, and the next. 6 weeks later, she walked out of that hospital. I'll never forget her smile. The British soldiers didn't just provide medical care, they provided human dignity. They washed people who couldn't wash themselves. They held cups to lips of those too weak to drink. They sat with the dying so that no one would die alone. These tough, combat-hardened men showed a tenderness that contradicted every stereotype about soldiers. They weren't just liberators, they were saviors. But the greatest threat wasn't starvation. It was typhus. The disease was spreading like wildfire through the camp. Typhus is carried by lice, and Bergen-Belsen was infested with them. Every prisoner was covered in lice. The barracks were crawling with them. And typhus was deadly, especially to people whose bodies were already at the point of collapse. The British faced a terrible dilemma. The only way to stop typhus was to delouse everyone and everything. But the standard method of delousing involved stripping people naked, shaving their heads and spraying them with DDT powder. For people who had already been dehumanized and brutalized, this process was traumatic, yet it was necessary to save their lives.
Captain Derek Sinkton, who we met in part 1, came up with a solution that showed remarkable sensitivity. He explained to the prisoners in multiple languages exactly what would happen and why. He assured them this was for their protection, not more persecution. He had British soldiers demonstrate the process first, stripping down and being deloused themselves to show it was safe. This simple act of respect and communication made an enormous difference. The delousing operation was massive. Entire barracks were emptied, fumigated, and cleaned. Every piece of clothing was either deloused or burned. Every prisoner went through the process. It took weeks, but slowly the typhus epidemic was brought under control. It was a triumph of British organizational capability and medical knowledge applied with compassion. Among the thousands of prisoners were stories that exemplified both the horror of what had happened and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Let me share just a few that the British soldiers recorded. There was Hadassah Rosensaft, a Polish Jewish woman who had been imprisoned for years. When the British arrived, she was so weak she couldn't stand. But she had appointed herself a leader among the Jewish women in the camp, organizing them, keeping their spirits up, fighting to keep them alive. As she recovered, she worked alongside the British medical teams, translating, comforting new arrivals, and helping to organize the survivors. She would later marry one of the survivors and become a powerful voice for Holocaust remembrance. Then there was Josef Rosensaft, who would become Hadassah's husband. He had survived multiple concentration camps before ending up at Bergen-Belsen. Despite his own terrible condition, he helped the British identify the worst Nazi guards and organize the survivor community. He spoke multiple languages and became an invaluable liaison between the British liberators and the diverse prisoner population. Lieutenant Colonel Gonen, who we mentioned in Part 1, formed a particular bond with a young Dutch woman who'd been in the camp for 2 years. She told him about the day the Nazis had separated her from her mother, whom she never saw again, about the friends who had died in her arms, about the time she had wanted to give up but somehow found the strength to continue. "Why did you keep going?" Gonen asked her. "Because," she said, "I knew someday someone like you would come. I knew the world couldn't let this continue forever." These stories of courage and survival are why we make these videos. If you're finding this history as compelling and important as we do, please take a moment to like this video and leave a comment. Your engagement helps us reach more people who need to hear these stories. Behind every medical miracle was a massive logistical operation that showcased British military efficiency at its finest. The Royal Army Service Corps transformed Bergen-Belsen into a death camp, into a functioning emergency city. Within days, they had brought in thousands of tons of supplies. Medical equipment, blankets, clothing, food, and water all had to be transported to the camp through Germany's war-damaged infrastructure. The British established field kitchens that produced hundreds of thousands of meals per day, each one carefully prepared according to the special dietary requirements. They brought in water purification equipment because the camp's water supply was contaminated. They set up proper sanitation systems to prevent the spread of disease. They erected tents and temporary shelters because the camp's barracks were so contaminated they had to be burned. All of this while the war was still ongoing and resources were desperately needed at the front lines. General Evelyn Barker, commander of the 8th Corps, made Bergen-Belsen his top priority. He diverted troops, vehicles, and supplies to the camp. When some questioned whether this was appropriate while the war continued, his response was simple and powerful. "This is what we've been fighting for. If we can't stop to save these people, then what was the point of any of it?" The British brought in bulldozers to dig proper graves for the thousands of dead. They organized burial details, working alongside German civilians whom they had brought in from nearby towns to witness what had been done in their country's name. These civilians claimed they didn't know. The British made sure they would never be able to deny it again.
While the rescue operation continued, another crucial task began: gathering evidence and holding perpetrators accountable. The British military police and intelligence officers started documenting everything. They took photographs, recorded testimonies, and preserved evidence that would later be used in war crimes trials. The camp commandant, Joseph Kramer, known as the Beast of Belsen, was arrested immediately. So were dozens of SS guards and capos. The British set up a detention area within the camp where these people were held under guard. Many of the survivors wanted immediate revenge. The British soldiers understood that feeling, but they were determined that justice would be served properly, through legal processes, not vigilante violence. Captain Sinkton interviewed Kramer extensively. What struck him most was not the man's cruelty, but his complete lack of understanding about why the British were upset. Kramer talked about running the camp as though he had been managing a factory. He complained about supply problems and administrative challenges. He showed no remorse for the thousands who had died under his watch. He genuinely didn't seem to understand that he had done anything wrong. That, Sinkton later wrote, was perhaps more frightening than if he had been a monster who enjoyed causing suffering. He was just a bureaucrat who happened to be part of a system dedicated to mass murder, and he did his job efficiently. The evidence the British gathered at Bergen-Belsen would play a crucial role in the Nuremberg trials and in the Bergen-Belsen trial that took place later in 1945. The photographs, testimonies, and documentation ensured that the world could never deny what had happened. We must also acknowledge the toll this took on the British soldiers who liberated the camp. These men were changed forever by what they witnessed. Many suffered from what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had nightmares for the rest of their lives. Some couldn't talk about their experiences for decades. Lieutenant Randall, whom we met in Part 1, said in an interview 50 years later, "Not a day has gone by that I haven't thought about Bergen-Belsen. The faces of those people are burned into my memory. I see them when I close my eyes. I'm glad we were there. I'm glad we could help. But the cost was carrying those images forever." Many of the medical students who volunteered to help at Bergen-Belsen changed their career plans afterward. They became specialists in nutrition, tropical diseases, or public health, dedicating their lives to ensuring such suffering never happened again. The experience at Bergen-Belsen shaped an entire generation of British medical professionals. By June 1945, about 2 months after liberation, the situation at Bergen-Belsen had stabilized. Most of the survivors who were going to make it had recovered enough to leave the camp. The British had saved approximately 40,000 lives through their quick action and innovative medical care. Yes, 13,000 had died after liberation, but without the British intervention, all 60,000 would have perished. The original camp was burned to the ground in May 1945. It was too contaminated, too filled with disease and death to remain standing. The British built a new displaced persons camp nearby, where survivors could live while they figured out where to go next. Many had no homes to return to. Their families were gone, their communities destroyed. The British worked with international relief organizations to help resettle these people, giving them a chance to rebuild their lives. In Part 3, our final installment, we'll explore the lasting impact of Bergen-Belsen's liberation. We'll look at how it changed British understanding of the war they had been fighting. We'll examine the trials that brought justice to the perpetrators. And we'll see how the survivors went on to become powerful voices, ensuring the world would never forget. Plus, we'll reveal another lesser-known story from British military history that will absolutely blow your mind.
Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on. Part 3 is coming soon, and you definitely don't want to miss the conclusion of this incredible story. 2 months after British soldiers opened the gates of Bergen-Belsen, the camp no longer existed. The barracks where tens of thousands had suffered were burned to the ground. But the story was far from over. In fact, what happened next would shape how the world understood the Second World War and ensure that the crimes committed there would never be forgotten. Welcome to the final part of our series on the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Today, we're exploring the aftermath, the pursuit of justice, and the incredible legacies of both the liberators and the liberated. This is where the story comes full circle, and I promise you, the ending will leave you with a new appreciation for what these British heroes accomplished. If you haven't watched parts 1 and 2, pause this video right now and go watch them. This story deserves to be experienced in full. And if you've been with us from the beginning, thank you. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these crucial stories to light. On September 17, 1945, just 5 months after liberation, a military court convened in Lüneburg, Germany. 45 defendants stood accused of war crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen and Auschwitz. This was the Bergen-Belsen trial, one of the first major war crimes trials of the post-war period, and it was conducted entirely by the British military justice system. Josef Kramer, the former commandant, stood in the dock, alongside his staff. SS guards who had beaten prisoners to death. Capos who had collaborated in the brutality. Female guards who had shown particular cruelty. All of them now faced British military justice, and the evidence against them was overwhelming. The prosecution was led by Colonel T.M. Backhouse, a brilliant British lawyer in uniform. He had spent months at Bergen-Belsen after liberation, gathering testimonies, documenting evidence, and building cases against each defendant. He was methodical, thorough, and determined that justice would be served properly. The trial lasted almost 2 months. Survivors came to testify, many of them still recovering from their ordeal. They told their stories in court, pointing to the defendants who had tormented them. Some broke down on the witness stand. Others showed remarkable composure, determined that the world would hear what had happened.
British soldiers who had liberated the camp also testified. They described what they had found, showed photographs and films, and provided expert testimony about the conditions. Medical officers explained how the systematic starvation had been implemented. The evidence was irrefutable. What struck observers was how ordinary many of the defendants seemed. These weren't monsters with horns and tails, they were regular people who had committed monstrous acts. Some claimed they were just following orders. Others said they hadn't known how bad things were. A few showed genuine remorse. Most did not. The court, composed of British military officers, deliberated carefully. On November 17, 1945, verdicts were announced. Josef Kramer was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. 10 others received the same sentence. 19 were sentenced to prison terms. 14 were acquitted due to insufficient evidence. On December 13, 1945, the death sentences were carried out at Hamelin Prison. British hangman Albert Pierpoint, who had executed hundreds of war criminals, ensured the process was quick and professional. Justice had been served, but as many noted, no punishment could ever balance the scale against such crimes. The Bergen-Belsen trial set important precedents. It established that following orders was not a defense for committing atrocities. It showed that war crimes could be prosecuted efficiently and fairly, and it sent a message that those who committed such acts would be held accountable. But the most powerful legacy of Bergen-Belsen came from the survivors themselves. These were people who had every reason to give up on humanity, to retreat into themselves and never speak of what happened. Instead, many became powerful advocates for memory, justice, and peace. Hadassah and Josef Rosensaft, whom we met in Part 2, married in Bergen-Belsen's displaced persons camp in 1946. Their wedding was attended by British soldiers who had helped liberate them. It was a celebration of life, of survival, of the human spirit refusing to be broken. They went on to have a son, immigrated to America, and dedicated their lives to Holocaust education and ensuring the world would never forget. Anita Lasker-Wallfish survived Bergen-Belsen because she could play the cello. The Nazis had forced her to play in the orchestra at Auschwitz before transferring her to Bergen-Belsen. After liberation, she was so weak the British medical teams didn't think she would survive. But she did. She went on to become a world-renowned cellist, playing with major orchestras and using her platform to speak about the Holocaust. She's still alive today, in her 90s, still sharing her story, still ensuring people remember. Many survivors returned to education, determined to rebuild their interrupted lives. They became doctors, lawyers, teachers, and artists. They raised families, often naming children after relatives who had perished. They built new lives while carrying the weight of their memories. And they made sure their experiences were documented for future generations. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen had a profound impact on British society and the British military. Before Bergen-Belsen, many Britons understood the war in terms of military conflict. They knew they were fighting against Nazi aggression, but the full scope of Nazi crimes wasn't widely known. Bergen-Belsen changed that.
The BBC's Richard Dimbleby had been at Bergen-Belsen shortly after liberation. His radio broadcast describing what he saw was so shocking that BBC editors initially refused to air it. They thought British audiences wouldn't believe it. Dimbleby threatened to resign unless they broadcast it. They did, and Britain was stunned. Suddenly the war had a moral dimension that went beyond geopolitics and military strategy. The newsreels and photographs from Bergen-Belsen were shown in British cinemas. The images were horrifying, but they were necessary. The British public needed to understand what they had been fighting against. It strengthened resolve, justified the sacrifices, and ensured support for the occupation and reconstruction of Germany. For the British military, Bergen-Belsen became a defining moment. It showed that soldiers could be more than warriors. They could be humanitarians, rescuers, and witnesses to history. The innovative medical techniques developed at Bergen-Belsen influenced British military medicine for decades. The emphasis on treating victims of severe malnutrition and disease in field conditions became part of military training. Many of the soldiers who liberated Bergen-Belsen stayed in touch with survivors they had helped. Letters were exchanged.
Some survivors named their children after British soldiers who had saved them. Reunions were held. These bonds, forged in the worst circumstances imaginable, lasted lifetimes. Today, the site of Bergen-Belsen is a memorial and museum. The original camp is gone, burned as the British ordered, but the memory remains. Thousands visit each year to learn, to remember, and to ensure such atrocities never happen again. There's a simple inscription at the memorial, erected by the British in multiple languages. Here lie 5,000 dead, at one mass grave. Here lie 1,000 dead, at another. These markers, placed by the British soldiers who buried the victims, stand as testament to both the horror that occurred and the dignity with which the liberators treated the dead. The British military maintains a special connection to Bergen-Belsen. Veterans of the liberation have returned for memorial ceremonies. The British Army continues to send representatives to annual commemorations. It's a recognition that what happened there was a crucial moment in British military history. In 2020, when the world was struggling with the COVID-19 pandemic, many drew parallels to the medical crisis at Bergen-Belsen. The innovative solutions British doctors developed there, the systematic approach to treating thousands of critically ill people simultaneously, provided lessons that remained relevant 75 years later. If this series has moved you, educated you, or made you think differently about this crucial period in history, please show your support. Like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to our channel. Your engagement helps us continue bringing these important stories to light. What can we learn from the liberation of Bergen-Belsen? First, that ordinary people can commit extraordinary evil when they abandon their moral compass and follow ideologies of hatred. The guards at Bergen-Belsen weren't specially selected monsters. They were regular people who were taught that some humans were less than human. That should terrify us, because it means it could happen again. Second, we learn that courage isn't just about combat. The British soldiers who waded into that nightmare, who held dying strangers, who worked until they dropped to save lives, showed courage that equaled any battlefield heroism. Real strength is choosing compassion when it would be easier to look away. Third, we learn that documentation and truth matter. The British decision to photograph everything, to record testimonies, to preserve evidence, ensured that deniers and revisionists could never erase what happened. In our age of misinformation, that lesson remains crucial. Fourth, we learn that the human spirit is remarkably resilient. Survivors of Bergen-Belsen went on to live full lives, to love, to create, to contribute to society. They refused to let their tormentors have the final word. That's a powerful message of hope.
Bergen-Belsen was not the only concentration camp the British liberated, but it was the largest and most shocking. British forces also liberated smaller camps and discovered evidence of Nazi crimes across Germany. Each discovery reinforced the righteousness of the Allied cause and the necessity of total victory over Nazism. American forces were simultaneously liberating camps in southern Germany. The Soviets were discovering camps in the east. Together, the Allies were revealing to the world the full scope of the Holocaust. Bergen-Belsen became symbolic of this revelation, particularly for British and Western audiences. The liberation also influenced post-war policy. It strengthened British resolve to thoroughly denazify Germany, to prosecute war criminals, and to ensure such ideologies could never rise again. The horror of Bergen-Belsen justified the harsh terms imposed on Germany and the extensive occupation that followed. In their later years, many British veterans of Bergen-Belsen's liberation spoke publicly about their experiences. Their reflections provide powerful insights into the lasting impact of what they witnessed. Lieutenant Colonel Gonen, in his 80s, said, "I've had a good life, a family, a career, years of peace, but I've never forgotten those faces, those people who suffered so much. If telling my story helps prevent such things from happening again, then carrying these memories was worthwhile." One medical orderly, speaking anonymously, said, "People thank me for my service at Bergen-Belsen. I appreciate that, but I always say, I didn't suffer, I was just a witness.
The real heroes were the people who survived what was done to them. My contribution was tiny compared to their strength. These humble responses are characteristic of that generation. They did extraordinary things, but rarely sought recognition. They considered it their duty, nothing more. That modesty makes their achievements all the more remarkable. The story of Bergen-Belsen doesn't end with the trial verdicts or the memorial services. It continues every time a survivor shares their testimony with a school group, every time a historian researches the camp's history, every time someone visits the memorial and commits to fighting hatred and intolerance. The British soldiers who liberated Bergen-Belsen set an example of how to respond to evil with determination, compassion, and a commitment to justice. They showed that military power must be coupled with moral purpose. They demonstrated that doing the right thing sometimes means taking on tasks far beyond your training or comfort zone. In today's world, where we still see ethnic cleansing, genocide, and systematic oppression in various forms, the lessons of Bergen-Belsen remain relevant. The courage of the liberators and the resilience of the survivors provide a roadmap for how to respond to such horrors. Document the crimes, hold perpetrators accountable, help the victims with compassion and respect. Never forget. The British military's role in exposing and responding to Nazi atrocities didn't end with Bergen-Belsen. There are dozens of other stories from this period that deserve to be told. Stories of daring rescues, of justice pursued against long odds, of ordinary soldiers making extraordinary moral choices. In upcoming videos, we'll be exploring more of these lesser-known chapters of British military history. Stories about the SOE agents who smuggled evidence of Nazi crimes out of occupied Europe. The code breakers who decoded messages revealing the Holocaust as it happened. The Jewish Brigade, British soldiers of Jewish heritage who hunted war criminals after the war ended. Each story is as compelling as the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, and each deserves to be remembered. We've reached the end of our three-part series on the liberation of Bergen-Belsen. Thank you for taking this journey with us. I know these videos have been heavy, difficult even, but these stories must be told. The men and women who lived through these events, both as victims and as liberators, deserve to be remembered. Their experiences contain lessons that remain urgent and relevant today. The British soldiers who opened those gates in April 1945 walked into hell and responded with courage, compassion, and determination. They saved tens of thousands of lives. They documented crimes that the world needed to see. They provided evidence that ensured justice was served, and they carried the weight of what they witnessed for the rest of their lives so that we would never forget. The survivors of Bergen-Belsen showed the world that the human spirit cannot be broken. They rebuilt their lives, raised families, contributed to society, and became powerful advocates for memory and justice. They ensured those who died were not forgotten, and that the lessons of the Holocaust would be passed to future generations. This is why we study history, not just to know what happened, but to understand why it matters today. Bergen-Belsen teaches us about the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. It shows us what can happen when hatred and dehumanization go unchecked, and it demonstrates how ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary evil, can choose to be heroes. Remember these stories, share them, learn from them, and commit yourself to ensuring that such horrors never happen again. That's the legacy of Bergen-Belsen, and it's a legacy worth honoring. Thank you for watching this series. If you found it valuable, please subscribe, like, and leave a comment below. We'll see you in the next video, where we continue exploring the incredible, often untold stories of British military history. Remember, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. Stay educated, stay engaged, and never forget.